At the turn of the millennium, in August 1999, the city of Ílhavo in Portugal was marked by a crime. Two bodies were found in a residence, victims of an attack that drew the attention of the entire country due to its brutality. As the investigation progressed, the couple's son became the main suspect, but there was still a controlling wife of this son. A band they had which society at the time called satanic. And to top it off, the atmosphere of fear and speculation. The night of the crime coincided with the last solar eclipse of the millennium. That sparked much discussion. Was it intentional? Coincidence? Who and for what reason took the couple's lives with so much anger? That's what we're going to find out in today's episode. Hey abducted ones, how are you all doing? I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome everyone. Just a reminder, 3 episodes every week here on the channel. So, if you like learning about real stories, I invite you to subscribe and follow the channel. If you can, join our members club as well, because you directly help with the production of our content here. If you can't right now, that's okay. You can like and comment on the video, which will already help a lot with engagement. Lately, my channel has kind of plateaued, you know, guys. It's not getting much reach, not really managing to reach new audiences. There are 2 metrics within the video analytics, you know. They show the returning audience and the new audience. So in most videos, the returning audience, you who like my work here, it's always way up there. But new audience, 0. So it shows that unfortunately the platform isn't able to, show my video. If each of you could share the content, it could be the video you like the most, it could be this one, any other from the channel, it would already help a lot, okay? A very emblematic case today, a case that really marked Portugal. This case shares some similarities with the well-known Susan von Richthofen case in Brazil. Not because of the characteristics of the crime itself, but because of everything that surrounded the crime. The victims were a couple, the parents of a person who was the main suspect. Behind this person, there was a supposedly controlling wife. In other words, there was a couple there who were plotting something to take the life of this man's parents, right? Who was part of that couple. For some reason that we'll find out during the story. There was also the whole issue of mysticism and Satanism, right? Because they linked the night of the crime with the last solar eclipse of the millennium. So they started raising the hypothesis that it had been a crime, of a satanic nature because of that issue. Mainly because the couple had a death metal band with friends. So at that time, in 1999, there was still a pretty mistaken consensus, I would say, not to mention even ignorant, right? Regarding this type of music, and they started insisting on that point, Satanism and all that. But my opinion is that there was really just pure malice there, A morbid plan by people who had very serious mental issues. And who planned that in a petty way to get something material that they wanted? The plan failed badly. The crime was quickly discovered, and we're going to learn the details. I'll give you the full details of this whole story. I'd also like to take this opportunity to send a special greeting to the people who follow us from Portugal, many wonderful people who leave comments here on the episodes. In fact, this episode is being produced by request, responding to requests from people in Portugal. And that's it, I've talked too much already. In the intro, comment, and let's get to the facts. It was around 4 in the afternoon on August 12th, 1999, when the police went to the residence of Mr. Jorge dos Santos and Mrs. Maria Fernanda dos Santos. Some neighbors noticed the couple's absence. Close neighbors who always communicated were always talking to each other. That day, they called for the couple, but no one answered, so already a bit suspicious, they called the police to do a welfare check. The police then arrived around 4 in the afternoon, knocked on the house, and no one answered. So they went inside. They went in, looked around the front part of the house, didn't find anything suspicious, but they kept moving forward. And in a certain part of the house, they noticed a blood stain that went from a kind of garden in front of the house to inside a door. They followed the blood stain inside and immediately saw it. In the kitchen, they already found the first body, which was Mrs. Maria Fernanda dos Santos, 48 years old. There were bloodstains throughout the house. The police continued the investigation, went up to the second floor, a townhouse, and there they found the body of Mr. Jorge dos Santos, 49 years old, a very well-known doctor in the Ílhavo region. On the body, they found signs of great violence, of brutality. Whoever the person was who did that had used a lot of anger to deliver those blows. The couple's body showed many signs of aggression. Besides these obvious wounds that the police officers found right away, in this initial inspection of the house, they noticed that the house was slightly messy. There was fuel on the woman's body. There were also matches, eggshells, and an open stove burner. That made it clear that the killers wanted to set the property on fire to suddenly destroy any evidence they might have left at the crime scene. The police officers also noticed that little was missing from the house. Nothing of value was missing, just a few objects, silly things, let's say, had been taken from the house. Besides the obvious missing item, the couple's car, there was nothing inside the house. Few signs of struggle. So, even though nothing of much value was taken from the property, the theory at that moment was robbery followed by murder, a robbery that had gone wrong. But I don't know if the police at that moment adopted that theory to start the investigation. They were skeptical. Because what it feels like looking at this description of the initial scene is that a robbery doesn't always happen with that much rage, right? Brutality in the execution of the people. Usually the criminal enters the house intending to steal, suddenly runs into the homeowner by surprise, and the crime happens quickly, right? A shot, a stabbing, a fatal blow, and escape. There were several signs of aggression, repetitions, repeated blows. In other words, whoever did that to the couple did it with a lot of anger. When the forensics team went to analyze the crime scene, things changed a little bit. They started to consider the couple's son, Antonio Jorge, known as Tojo, as the main suspect. Mainly because the items taken from the house were specific personal belongings. I'd say whoever took them knew exactly where they were. So that mess around the crime scene seemed staged, planned. Things were turned over in a way that was kind of... Someone did it. It wasn't by accident, like a bump or a slip. Things seemed staged, like a set-up crime scene. And there's also the fact that Tojo, the son of the murdered couple, wasn't in a very good financial situation. He was planning, he longed for a better life, financially speaking. All of this, later on, after hearing witnesses and people who knew the couple, started to make sense. So, this theory, this main suspect at that moment, made perfect sense in the investigators' minds. But Tojo had an alibi, a clear alibi, which would be investigated. On the night of his parents' murder, Tojo was not in Ílhavo. Tojo had gone on a short vacation, let's say, with his wife Sara Machado on August 7th. They were traveling. They went to Coimbra, Figueira da Foz, Praia da Vieira, São Pedro de Moel, Nazaré, and Peniche. They made those trips by car, a car that was registered in Sara's father's name. And they didn't always have money to stay in hotels. So on some nights they slept in the car, which Sara, Tojo's wife, didn't like, but I'll tell you more about Sara turning up her nose at the couple's lodging situation in a moment. What we have for now are the initial statements, both from Tojo and from Sara. They said they had arrived in São Pedro de Moel 2 days before the crime. And Tojo said that for some reason he had an argument with his wife and decided to go for a walk alone on the beach. He went into the sea, and since the waves were very rough, he supposedly hit himself on some rocks on the beach. And so he got an injury on his hand. Take a look at this injury. When he got back to where they were staying, Sara asked what he had done to his hand, and he explained that he had gone into the sea and hit a rock there and ended up hurting his hand. Well, at first, that was the end of the story. Sara supposedly believed Tojo's story, and it was already August 14th, which means 2 days after Tojo's parents were murdered. At that moment, Sara's father called where they were staying and told them they needed to return to Ílhavo because Tojo's parents were not in good health. So, they returned to Ílhavo. And at that moment, Sara's father told them what had happened, right? He told them about the death of Tojo's parents, the murder, and everything else. It's said that Tojo had a look of astonishment, of being scared, without understanding what was happening. He even said, "But why would they do that to my parents?" They never hurt anyone, but as I said, the police already suspected that the person behind that crime was Tojo, so they didn't believe that story or Tojo's look of surprise. With that suspicion hanging in the air, Sara was called in for questioning again, this time without Tojo and with some police pressure. Sara told a very different story from the version they gave in the first statement. Sara said they were having lunch at a restaurant in the São Pedro de Mol area when they started arguing over financial issues. At that point in their lives, only Tojo was working while Sara was just studying. And at that moment, they argued because Sara always wanted to stay in lodgings in hotels. And Tojo said that he was short on money, so they needed to sleep in the car. Remember when I said Sara refused to sleep in the car? Yeah, so that would have been the reason that caused the argument, right? It led to an argument between the couple, and Tojo would have gotten very irritated. So he just left the restaurant where they were eating, got in the car, and disappeared without saying where he was going. Remember, he would have gotten irritated because of financial issues. Tojo then, after disappearing, would have met up with Sara again. Only the day after this disappearance, which was August 12th, the day of the crime, he came to talk to Sara that afternoon and his hand was injured. And this version from Sara kind of corroborated the first statement. She said that her husband had gone out for a walk on the beach, very upset, and for some reason, he got hurt during that walk. Very well. While all this was unfolding, Tojo already started to realize that he was becoming the main suspect in that murder, in those murders. For that reason, 4 days after the crimes, Tojo ended up confessing to committing the crimes, according to what he reported in interviews long after the events. Years later, he said that the police were putting pressure on his mind, saying that Sara would be arrested because she was contradicting herself in her statements. Anyway, they took on a strategy there of psychological pressure on Tojo, and for that reason, according to Tojo, he confessed to the crime. And so he would have told then the version of what actually happened, or how almost everything happened. He had to travel 130 kilometers to commit the murders. Tojo admitted he argued with his wife Sara, but said he didn't take the car or disappear like that. He did get on a bus and went to a place where he got off. He bought some clothes. He also bought a backpack and a kitchen knife. Then he took another means of transportation and went to a place near Ílhavo. And then he walked the rest of the way to his parents' house. So Tojo arrived at his parents' house and knocked on the door. His mother was surprised, right? Because she knew he was traveling with his wife, she opened the door. They went inside, started talking, went upstairs to the second floor where Tojo's father was, and there they supposedly started an argument, because Tojo entered pointing at his father and saying, "You're to blame for all this misfortune happening to me. You're the one to blame for my situation." Of course the father was shocked, right? Caught off guard by his son, pointing his finger in his face, saying he was the one to blame. He reacted to these attacks and they started arguing verbally. The argument escalated, right? A physical fight ended with them on the ground. Tojo managed to grab the knife he had in his backpack, and that's when the crime began. He started stabbing his father. Tojo's mother was shocked, perplexed by what was happening, and she tried to run away. She went down the stairs to the first floor of the house. At that moment, Tojo came out from where his father was already covered in blood, mortally wounded. He went down after his mother, who had already managed to leave the house and was already outside. There, he caught up with his mother and started attacking her, also stabbing her multiple times. After she lost consciousness, he dragged her body back inside. And that explains that initial scene where the police went to the house after the neighbors noticed the couple's absence. The blood stain was outside the house, and that trail of blood led to the kitchen area of the property right there on the first floor. At that moment, Tojo says in his statement, right? During the interrogation, he panicked, becoming desperate when he realized his actions. It suggests that he actually argued with Sara, unless he planned this story very well to hide something Sara may have done. That's a lot of passion, right? But assuming that all of this really happened, he argued with Sara and got really pissed off, right? Due to the money problem and the woman influencing him, he lost control and went to punish his parents. The fact is that he was furious, mostly because of this, this poisoning, because of that fight. He went there already with the intention of killing his parents. After he did it and saw the blood on the floor, he panicked. So he chose to destroy all the evidence of the crime. That's why he poured fuel and grabbed everything flammable in the house to try to start a fire. But he couldn't do it. So he decided to fake a robbery, and he did a really sloppy job, right? Because right away the forensic experts there, just like what happened in Suzanne's case here in Brazil, right? As soon as they arrive at the crime scene during the first sweep, for someone with a trained eye, it's immediately clear that whoever did it was someone who knew the dynamics of the house very well. And that's what happened in Tojo's case as well. At that moment, Tojo takes some things from the house, some objects. He puts everything in his backpack, steals his parents' car, and flees to Mara Beach. So he takes all the objects, goes to this place, changes his clothes, supposedly into the clothes he bought on the way there, right? When he was planning the steps to commit the crime. Remember that he bought some clothes. He rode there, then continued on foot. Most likely, he changes his clothes at that location and abandons the car in an isolated area near that beach. Very well, continuing with Tojo's statement, he says yes. He was very angry at his father, who had treated him like an executioner since childhood. So, the police were startled when he started giving this statement, right? Because he was very angry when he did that. He totally disregarded love, right? From both parents to son. And on top of all that, he put the anger that he supposedly felt, right? A deep aversion toward his parents, especially his father, whom he called an executioner, for everything this father supposedly did to him during his childhood. That every argument in the house, whenever it happened, fingers were pointed at Tojo. This, of course, from his perspective, his own testimony. And here comes a more factual point in the story. The police also found Tojo's mother's diary in the house, and in that diary there were some entries where the mother, she showed like some dissatisfaction with the marriage, right? With her husband saying that the marriage wasn't going very well anymore. And actually that's also a fact. They even got legally separated, so they were no longer legally married, but they chose to keep living together. So in a way that kind of gave some support for it, right? For Tojo's statement that his father wasn't a very nice person to live with very well. So after this confession and all these details, Tojo, along with the officers, went to the place where he abandoned the car, where he had the objects he took from the house, and also the weapon used in the crime, the knife. From then on, Tojo had a warrant for his arrest, preventive detention pending trial. But do you think the story ended that simply? Of course not. There was still a lot more to unfold in this case. It was from that moment on, right? After the statements during Tojo's preventive detention, the investigators began to raise new suspicions. They thought it was unlikely that Tojo could have carried out that murder in such a cruel way, all by himself. And then they raised the possibility that he had accomplices. And then the Satanist issues also started to come up. They raised questions about satanic rituals. They talked about that issue, about the last solar eclipse of the millennium. Then all the speculation started of a more mystical nature, I would say. And all of this, guys, together with the social context of 1999, okay? There wasn't like this amount of information that we have today. Most information, like news and headlines, was still mainly spread by word of mouth. And when this Satanist issue started being speculated, man, it was a feast for the sensationalist newspaper headlines. It was splashed on the front page as satanic rituals, satanic crime in Ílhavo. I'll tell you about his band later, okay? But a death metal band involved in a satanic crime. Anyway, then it was that story you can probably imagine, right? Very well. Tojo, guys, was arrested on August 16th, 4 days after the crime. And he himself, with his statements and also with the things he did while in detention, kind of corroborated all that mystique around what was brought up, right? That whole satanic thing and everything. Because he wrote a letter to Sara, who only went to visit him in jail 10 days later, accompanied by her parents, saying that she intended to go on with her life alone. They got married in 1994, so they had been married for about 5 years. After all this happened, if Tojo did this because of her, she went there and gave him a real kick in the butt, saying she was going to go on with her life alone. And despite that, he wrote her a letter in jail. That letter also fueled the mystique, Satanism, and more, because in the letter, he called Sara the goddess of fire. And there's more, folks. In that letter, Tojo makes some really interesting remarks. He says that the psychologist, who had already talked to him in jail, said that he had perfectionist tendencies, that he was an obsessive guy, that he didn't want to disappoint anyone, that he needed to do everything the right way. Then he starts talking about Sara, right? She was like a goddess to him, and he couldn't bear to see her suffer or sad. He always had to be doing something to make her feel good, to make her feel fulfilled. There's another part of the letter where he says, which is, for me, at the time my parents were responsible for over the 10 years of torment, repression, agony, and terror, having exhausted and damaged part of my mental health. Then he goes on describing, right? He shows resentment toward his parents and questions this so-called love in several passages of the letter, right? A very deep feeling for Sara, which is really more like a kind of chemical dependency. It even gives that impression. He even says here that on the wedding day, he set out to enter a kind of state where he was always wanting to do things for Sara. In other words, he says that the marriage was his choice to fulfill that goddess. A letter that already starts to show us a certain panorama of Tojo's life. You know, Antonio Jorge. For those who don't remember, that's the man's name. Where he really shows that he has some psychological issues. You know, all this perfectionism, this need to please people too much. What I understand is that, in fact, he must have argued with Sara and she for some reason, right? She kept talking in his ear about these financial issues and he didn't want to disappoint his wife. Up until that moment, maybe they were still managing to keep the marriage going with ups and downs, but they were getting along. Maybe on that trip they took because Sara wanted nice hotels, he had to sleep in the car since he had no money. That's when she started, to argue about it. Tojo lost it and went there to do what he did with his parents, precisely because he blamed them for something for his financial situation. But let me tell you guys a little about how Tojo is, okay? Antonio Jorge and Sara met. They met back in high school, guys, while they were studying together. Then they started talking and everything, and even though they were quite different, they ended up getting into a relationship. Sara was described as a very outgoing, cheerful person. You know, that natural leader type, The kind of person who draws people to her like a sort of magnet. While Antonio Jorge Tojo was a withdrawn, shy guy kept to himself. They were opposites, and in this case, opposites attracted. This relationship began in high school in 1993. And it was also that year that they founded the death metal band, which became the subject of much discussion. In this case, they also had 2 friends in that band. Tojo, guys, was the vocalist and guitarist of the band, while Sara was the drummer. So they had a lot in common, despite their different personalities. One was introspective and the other was extroverted. They started dating, but the sources I researched don't say why the parents didn't really accept this relationship. So they went to Lisbon, kind of running away to Lisbon because of this lack of acceptance of their relationship by their families. So they stayed there for a while, fearing this rejection. And at some point in their story, they somehow managed to convince their parents that they really loved each other. And then they went back to their hometown, Ílhavo. All of this, guys, was also influenced by financial issues, okay? They had the desire to really achieve financial independence, but of course they were very young. And that was going to take a while to happen, right? They took the worst possible path, if that's what they were looking for, right, when they planned all this. And actually, already giving you this overview, we can already see some of the reasons why the crime happened, right? Could it have just been a little switch flipped in Tojo's head, a break from normality? Maybe. But could it also have been a plan? A premeditated crime, in the sense that they wanted independence to somehow take what belonged to Tojo's parents? That's possible too. All of that was brought up, okay? But let's take it step by step. Well, so after the couple came back from that little getaway they took, right? Because they weren't accepted, then everything was more or less back to normal, let's say, right? Both of their parents were already accepting the relationship, so much so that when they came back, they went to live at Tojo's parents' house. And at that time, Tojo started taking a computer course. About 11 months later, he got a job, while Sara was still studying marketing, actually, at a Portuguese Institute of Administration and Marketing. Portuguese Institute of Administration and Marketing. And at that point in their lives, they were kind of supported by both sets of parents. They had some financial help both from her parents and his. But Tojo was already working, you know, after those 11 months studying computer science and everything. But there were a lot of arguments at home, especially with Tojo's father. For that reason, at some point they left Tojo's parents' house and went to live at Sara's parents' house. And Tojo received a salary for his information technology work, but he also got an allowance from his parents, an allowance that was even bigger than his own salary. So they had money, even though it wasn't enough to achieve the financial independence they wanted, but yes, they did have money. If that was something that also caused frustration for Tojo and Sara, I can't say for sure. Most likely, right? Maybe it was a matter of humiliation, you know, because they were still being supported by their parents. Notice how things start to emerge, right? The killer mentality starts to emerge. Yeah, there are several elements in this case, right, guys? And just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, in one of those letters that Tojo wrote to Sara, already in prison, he talks about this whole situation. He lived on his allowance and work. He said it was fine for him, but not for her. She always thought that wasn't enough. And he also says that he never expected her to turn her back on him in that situation he was facing. So you see, right, that Sara really is a fundamental factor in this whole criminal story, isn't she? Even though only Tojo is in prison at the moment. And just to let you know, he has already been tried and convicted. Sara plays a very important role in shaping the mind of a killer. You know that saying about killing without getting your hands dirty? That's it. And look how interesting this is. All these letters that Tojo wrote, addressed to Sara and also to some friends, they ended up in the hands of the police. And they helped the police with the argument that he wouldn't have been able to commit that crime alone. And so I think it could have even been done alone, just by Tojo, the way he described it in his first statement. But there was a lot, right? Come on. Don't you guys think so? But the police didn't really believe that he actually had material help in carrying out the criminal acts. Precisely through the analysis of these letters, which show what Tojo's state of mind was like throughout his life, especially in the moments leading up to the crime. Tojo, according to these letters, was literally, little by little, being abandoned by everyone. And there's a part of the letter where he says, "Oh, I really need to see Sara, explain things to her, apologize to her." He wrote these parts addressed to a friend named Helder Teixeira in the year 2000 when he was already in prison. He said, "I tried to come up with a story that would put Sara aside, but she never called." And because of that letter, in his desperation to protect Sara, the woman, he ended up condemning her, right? Condemn her, in quotes, right? Put her in the investigator's sights. I wanted to make up a story that kept her out of the spotlight. When the police read that, it became clear that Tojo had made a mistake, right? He invented a story where he set his wife aside, though she was still involved. The only questions left were how, why, and in what way she was involved. And that's when the police talked to Tojo again. And while talking and putting a little pressure on him, he finally gave in and said he wanted to make a new confession. Tojo said that if it were up to him, that crime would never have happened. He said that in the summer of 1999, he, together with Sara, started planning that Jorge and Maria Fernanda dos Santos had to die. Tojo makes a revelation that's not surprising at all for us who are getting to know the story now, right? He said it was Sara who had this idea. She said they needed to die so that finally they could achieve financial independence. One of the reasons that made Sara take this extreme step to quickly achieve financial independence is that she had apparently failed the course she was taking. And she didn't want to tell anyone about it because it was another step of frustration in the whole family's life of humiliation. She urgently needed to achieve financial independence. Notice how she was completely disconnected from reality, right? The woman was out of her mind too. And he was completely whipped there, right? Literally a henpecked man who fell for her sweet talk and ended up in a dead end. And then since Sara was his queen, his goddess, the woman he never said no to, the one he never wanted to see sad or hurt, when she started talking about this plan, in his mind, he had no way out, right? He was already conditioned. His brain was already programmed not to hurt his darling. Tojo also says in this new confession, in this new statement, that he did argue yes a few times, offering Sara options by saying, we can do this or that. But then she kept insisting, and he said there was nothing else he could do. He needed to give her this proof of love. Can you imagine proving your love by killing your own parents? That's something, isn't it? The people who were interviewed, who knew the couple, also gave very enlightening statements. They said that Sara was kind of the dominant one in the relationship, right? Everyone who knew the couple said that Tojo did everything to please his wife and that she was like dominant in the relationship. And she really kept the guy on a tight leash. And very well, they were having this conversation, making this plan. Tojo was already convinced that he was really going to do it. Together, they planned and premeditated the crime. They came to the conclusion that it would really be the easiest way for them to achieve independence. They made all the plans with this trip they were going to take, right? Which started on August 7th. They were creating their alibi, right? So Tojo went there, but he was traveling. Supposedly, no one saw the man stealthily do what he did. So they had a strong alibi. If it weren't for that confession, in this version of events that Tojo was giving, Sara was the mastermind behind the crime. In fact, she was the one who bought the items he used to commit the crime. For example, clothes, a sheet to hide his hair, a hat, 2 knives, and a flashlight, all bought at the hypermarket in Coimbra. In fact, the police found this purchase record on Sara's credit card statement. Tojo also claims Sara planned everything and disposed of the crime evidence. With this new testimony in hand, while the police were investigating everything, they saw the judge issue an arrest warrant for Sara. But it was only house arrest. Sara stayed comfortably at her house while Tojo was serving his sentence in jail. But Sara was only under house arrest for a short time because they kept investigating. But there was no evidence directly linking her to Tojo's claim, so she ended up being released. And at this point in the investigation, a new name comes up, okay guys? Nuno Lima. There was suspicion that he had collaborated in the crime, and he was also put under preventive house arrest. All of this because of the things I'm going to tell you about now, about the death metal band, Satanist issues and all that. With this testimony from Tojo, the police actually started to believe in that theory that it had been a crime, a work for the devil, a crime of Satanism, and everything else done together with the members of that band. The police were convinced that in fact, Tojo was not capable of committing that crime in such a brutal, bestial way, alone. And then when he started confessing about the whole issue with the woman, other evidence began to emerge. This theory of a satanic crime gained strength. And then you know how it is, right? The press helped spread this. There started to be a buzz in the city that it was a satanic crime. Kind of, right? No reaction at all. The police also wanted to prove that, in fact, it was a crime with this mystical aspect. That's where the issue comes in that Tojo only dressed in black. The band members were also into death metal, and they planned this, according to the police, right? They supposedly planned to carry out the crime on this day, when the last solar eclipse of the millennium would happen. I'll briefly discuss an issue that unfortunately I don't know if it was only from that time or still exists. Such recklessness, without any evidence it happened, borders on ignorance since this kind of thing does exist. But to speculate about something like this just because the guys had a band is kind of bizarre, right? It's that same story as when a crime happens, and people say it's because so-and-so watched a movie or played a game just because of one isolated thing. So you can't say that was the reason that led to a crime. To get to the point of committing a crime, especially a crime like this, with so much fury and anger, there are several factors involved. That could have contributed, especially if they were Satanists involved in rituals. It could, but what I'm saying is the popular opinion, the public opinion at the time. The tabloid newspapers created a sense that there was prejudice going on. All they discussed was the band. It was a death metal thing. They wore black, had crosses, long hair. It was all just prejudice. At that moment, there was no factual evidence that there had been a ritual. The eclipse thing could have just been a big coincidence, you know? But even though that comparison was unfounded, all this stuff that surrounded the story really tainted it. The musical style at the time, made everyone really prejudiced against that genre. This was a topic of discussion on radio shows, on television programs in Portugal. Everything revolved around the fact that there was a connection to the Ílhavo crime, with death metal, and all those heavier rock music styles. The crime scene showed that it was a crime of rage, of fury, The woman tried to escape, but the man grabbed and dragged her inside after already killing the father upstairs on the second floor. There were elements suggesting that even though it was staged, an argument had actually occurred. You might even argue otherwise, but the Satanist issue was just the reason they went there to commit the crime. Obviously, maybe it didn't happen on the day they planned, right? Just make an effort to think about that. Anyway, guys, because of all this mess, all these issues, just a few months after the crime, the police already had 4 suspects. It was Antonio Jorge Machado, right? Tojo, his wife, Sara, and also, let me see here, Nuno Lima, Helder Teixeira, and later Marco Antonio also got involved. All of them members and participants of this death metal movement, and everything else, people who were later discarded. Just to sum it up for you, right? Which shows that the investigation was a big mess. The fact is that 2 of these extra suspects were dismissed and the charges continued against Tojo, Sara, and Nuno. Just so you have an idea, Tojo was already 25 years old and Sara 26. She was a year older than him, and Nuno was 21 years old. All of them then were put on trial. Why? Because according to in the indictment, all of them professed the worship of Satan, the worship of death. But Nuno's involvement in the crime wasn't very clear, neither in the arguments during the trial nor in the police investigation. None of that. The only thing they had was that supposedly a trace of Nuno's blood had been found in Tojo's parents' car, the one he abandoned near a beach. He explained that Tojo and he communicated by letters, and they always sealed the letter with a drop of blood. Maybe that's why his blood was found in Tojo's parents' car. There was also an alleged neighbor who saw the murdered couple's car on the morning of the crime, with 2 people inside. Then, that car left. So, who were those 2 people inside the car? Tojo and this Nuno? Tojo and Sara? There's no way to know. It's just a neighbor who supposedly saw that. And that's all the information we have about Nuno's involvement in the crime. Then, several people were heard during the trial, which was basically centered around this issue, then about the black clothes from the death metal band, the Satanism and everything else. And one of these people said that Sara was the band's songwriter, that she wrote all the lyrics, and the lyrics talked about heavy stuff. And it was really confirmed that she had control over Tojo. Nuno himself, who was listed as a suspect and accused because he was at the trial, right? He defined Tojo as a guy who was much more connected to earthly things than to spiritual ones. So, for this Nuno, who was being questioned as both the accused and as a witness, in his mind it had nothing to do with anything satanic. Yes, it was a material crime, likely planned by Sara and Tojo. Do you think it ended there? It went way beyond that, okay? There were conversations between the police in Portugal and other countries where similar crimes were happening, right? With involvement of Satanism and criminals who dressed in black. Anyway, it was a big mess. Actually, there was no concrete evidence. Everything was based on assumptions. What really happened for sure is that in Ílhavo, in Portugal, a ruthless, cruel crime had taken place against the parents of one of the accused who ended up confessing to the crime. He gave several versions, but he was always the one identified as the perpetrator, and that was the concrete fact. It was a strange trial, full of doubts and questions that were never answered. The three of them were sitting in the dock: Tojo, his wife Sara, and their friend Nuno. It was clear and obvious during the trial that Sara and Nuno were trying to put all the blame for the crime on Tojo. Besides all that purely speculative matter, you know? Sara acted like a victim there, didn't she? She said the opposite of what Tojo said about her. That actually he was controlling and told her how she should dress. Anyway, she put herself in the opposite position to what Tojo and the witnesses said, that she was a toxic and controlling person. She presented herself as the opposite. Since there wasn't anything very concrete against her, she was listed as the accused, but would certainly go unpunished. Sara said that after Tojo's arrest, he persistently called her at her parents' house while she was released, wasn't she? And she had to change her phone number. She said he was very obsessive, and in fact, he himself said that he was obsessed with her. But the truth is, as the trial went on, the main question remained: how did Tojo, by himself, manage to stab his parents dozens of times? He himself described again at the trial how everything happened. He said he fought with his father, fell to the ground. His father and mother tried to take the knife from him, but neither of them succeeded. He ran after his mother, stabbed her outside the house, then dragged her inside. In other words, he described again how everything happened. Sara also said that Tojo was very angry with his parents and had already fought with them several times. Anyway, she wanted to put all the blame on her husband, her ex-husband. Now, at the end of the trial, after 2 months of trial, in short, I summarized a lot for you, but much happened. Mainly focused on the issue of the bands, the songs, and the prejudice that happened. Also, in this part about living together, relationships, psychological issues, and so on. But the judges understood that it wasn't Tojo who dominated the woman, but rather Sara who dominated him. It was also not proven that he hated his parents or that he had ever fought with them. And in the sentence read on April 17th, 2001, it was clear that many doubts remained. There was no absolute certainty about what happened on the day of the crimes. This greatly benefited Nuno and Sara, due to the fact that there was no full certainty of their involvement in the murders. On the day using the knife, they were acquitted. That, in law, this is called in dubio pro reo, meaning that in case of doubt, the defendant is favored. And Tojo, my friends, who always confessed, always gave details of what he did at the crime scene. There were several versions that he told, but there was always a lot in common in those versions. So the court said, all right, it really was you who did it. Therefore, Tojo was sentenced to the maximum penalty in Portugal, which is 25 years. He was seen as normal and capable, showing no signs of disturbance. Just one thing that happened after Tojo's conviction is that there were more developments regarding the inheritance, which was the main factor for them to have financial independence. This inheritance was the cause of many legal disputes, also in Portugal. But I'll summarize it for you. With Tojo's grandparents, they were extremely shocked by the murder of the paternal grandparents. They went to court to claim the inheritance, and this dragged on for a long time. Tojo's grandfather passed away. After the crime, the grandmother went to court to get compensation for what her grandson had done to her son. All of this played out in court for years. Tojo didn't have the money to pay the compensation, so they turned to an organization that makes these court-ordered payments. When the convicted person can't afford it, this agency reviews the case and said that Tojo had the means to make the payment, but he didn't pay. This dragged on over time, and the lady, Tojo's grandmother, didn't receive anything. The house itself in Ílhavo, where the crime happened, was under a mortgage, and years after the murders, it was sold. That money ended up going to the bank as compensation and for legal matters related to debts. The house was sold. Surprisingly, some interested people bought the house and said they didn't care about what had happened years before. Everything seemed fine to them. They repainted and renovated the house, which still stands today. But it wasn't only the house that changed. Maybe with the new paint, everyone involved has changed over the years. Sara even got married, had a child, and keeps her distance from this whole story. She doesn't give interviews. Nuno disappeared. No one really knows where he is. And Tojo, my friends? He served 17 years in prison. He was sentenced to 25. And on the day precisely, but let me check here. On March 7th, 2017, he was released. He earned this parole by studying in prison, looking for a job, and demonstrating good behavior. He convinced the judge or the judicial system of Portugal that he was fit to be reintegrated into society. The full completion of his sentence ends in August 2024. Therefore, Tojo is now a free man. Given everything I've told you, dear abductees, what do you think? Do you think Sara was involved in the crime? That Nuno, that blood, was it a coincidence? Was there any kind of involvement, any help? Was Sara the mastermind? Whether intellectually or not, was it all Tojo's idea even if he was poisoned? Maybe because of financial issues, trying to gain independence. What do you think? What's your opinion about this crime? From Portugal, which I brought to you at the request of our friends who always follow the episodes. That's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for your company. A kiss from Ruivo. See you in the next episode.